Hey everyone, thanks for joining. We'll get started in about 2 minutes. So we'll just let others roll in and then we'll get started here shortly.
Hello.
Hey Alex.
How are you?
Good, good. We have a few folks joining already, and I
Yeah.
mentioned that we'll wait a couple of minutes, like maybe a minute more to get started.
Uh, Sorry, let's wait. But yeah, while we wait, we didn't have time to catch up on the AI summit, which you just returned from. How was it?
Yeah, it was great. Like I went to the AI Summit last week in New York. It was really exciting. A lot of agentic workflows, lots of agents automating a lot of the junior kind of intern level workflows. So a lot of discussion around that. And I think the robotics and AI was pretty cool. I saw that. And how Boston Dynamics is now infusing a lot of AI into their robots. There was like a really funny part where the AI or the robotics with AI was competing with human dancer, and the human dancer was doing some hip hop moves. And essentially, let's just say that AI is not going to be competing in dance competitions, right? Like it's not happening anytime soon. That was really interesting to see, but it was a fun conference for sure.
Okay, okay. But was it at least fun to watch those robots dance, or was it more the cringy?
It was funny. It was actually fun because they were trying their best, of course, but they were tripping, and there was this dog robot that was trying to dance like that hip hop dancer, and it was tripping and yeah, struggling quite a lot. But yeah, it was interesting.
Hopefully, soon we will see the competitions between robots and the humans. I think that would be fun to watch.
Yep, for
But
sure.
but yes, I guess you've talked also with a lot of people on the coding assistants, I would assume. I'm curious, did you see any difference from other events in that regard, like what kind of tools I use and whatnot? And speaking of tools, actually, let me start up the poll for the people who are joining. We also would be curious to hear what are your thoughts on what you are using, and do you like it or not? Let me start up the poll. Yeah.
Yeah, there were a lot of developer tools out there, especially around DevOps and whatnot. None of these players were there. We were, of course, there, but I'm
Mhm.
curious to hear what developers are using. Interestingly, we have what, 4 out of 5, 80%
Yeah, I
use
can see a lot of Copilot. Yeah.
yeah, cursor.
Yeah, is it? Yeah, Cursor. It's interesting because I think we also discussed this before. A lot of people in US tend to use Cursor, whereas, or at least in the conference, you hear a lot about Cursor. But then in Europe, and I've been attending a lot of events in Europe, most of the people mention Copilot, which is an interesting difference and resembles what we see now in the polls. Like a lot of Copilot users and not so many Cursor. Someone uses also ChatGPT in the browser. That's an interesting a couple of people. And yeah, on the likability, it seems to be pretty distributed. It doesn't look like anybody is extremely happy. So there is definitely a lot of room to improve. And I think that one of the things we will be talking today about is the way to improve the code assistance and how you already which kind of tools you can use to get better at getting the code suggestions, code generation from those assistants, and specifically Zencoder. With that, I guess we can switch to the main part of the webinar, and I can see that we have 17 people. So I think the majority is here already. That's nice. Hello everyone again, especially for those who joined late. But yeah, Archie, back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Yeah, very interesting. A lot of folks using Copilot, Cursor. I think Copilot is the majority here, looks like, within the poll. One of the things I'll start talking about is really, we have seen these stats around Copilot. I think this is Copilot stat is around 55% improvement in faster development, better improvement in coding, just productivity wise, and developers do feel more confident in the code quality. These are stats reported by Copilot. What is not reported and goes under the hood, and this is a very good study done by kind of leading research firm in the dev space, is that like code rotation and churn of the code, which is basically percentage of lines that are revised after 2 weeks of code generation in AI has increased by 200%. There's also increase in code renewal rate, which is code that is deleted shortly after it's added. And then only 38% of the code has been accepted by developers. And these are shocking stats, and these are the problems we at Zencoder are going to solve. The problems are exacerbated by essentially complex processes in the SDLC. Developers are getting burned out by repetitive tasks. I've spoken to a lot of enterprises, Alex, and like the stat that surprises me is about 70 to 80% of what developers do today is basically keep what I call keeping the lights on work, right? It's not really innovation and creativity. It's really just keeping the lights on for the organization. And it could be things like code refactoring, managing technical debt, things like that. And the last kind of, but not least, is really like demand for faster software development is it's accelerating with AI for sure. The challenges around incorrect code exacerbates all of these challenges. And a typical AI assistant works more like an LLM is called, and the code hallucinates quite a lot, and the user has to rewrite code. And that's happening with a lot of the players out there today. Even when they add what we call repo grokking, which is basically our kind of secret sauce around code base understanding, there are still hallucinations. It's much better, but there are still hallucinations. And that's why what we at Zencoder do is add another layer of agentic repair pipeline where essentially we are correcting the code after adding a ton of context and understanding the AST file structure for the underlying IDE programming languages and whatnot. So that results in a lot of code that is much closer to production quality and can compile easily. So with that, just for two big advantages, again, repo grokking, which is basically understanding that the underlying code base, the AST file structure of the programming languages in the IDEs you work in, VS Code and variations of JetBrains. And the second advantage is around agentic loop and repair, where we are essentially not just giving you the code. We oftentimes call LLMs even hundreds of times if it's complex kind of coding agent task in repairing the code, removing the syntax errors, and giving you compile-ready code. Speaking of which, Alex, I see a lot of when I go to social media, there's a lot of folks generating games and whatnot with these coding assistants. I wonder if we can do that with Zencoder, like if Zencoder can produce those games.
We can definitely try. And actually, let me ask our audience here what kind of game they want us to build as a sort of proof of concept. I just started a new poll. But yeah, I just wanted to also reiterate on the things you mentioned, like on the context and whatnot. I think it is also especially important when we are talking about large code bases, especially in the enterprise, because there is a lot of legacy code usually associated with that. And I think it's indeed can lead quite quickly to burnout and whatnot, especially when you come to the project and then the only thing you are responsible to do is just rewriting the code or just supporting all the legacy stuff. I think last year there was a news about American government looking for COBOL developers. So it's language which is out of commission for tens of decades, but it's still some sort of system. Apparently, is written in COBOL, which is weird. Okay, so I guess we have a
Flappy
winner
Bird.
for the
Flappy
Flappy
Bird
Bird.
is
Yes,
what
sorry.
we are making, looks
All
like.
right, all right. Let's see. Let's try to generate Flappy Bird. I don't have any images or whatnot for the birds, but let's see if Zencoder will be able to do that for us. So let's ask it to create a Flappy Bird in Python without any PNG images or whatever, because I don't have them prepared. I will try to do that for next webinar. Maybe Zencoder will be able to do that in the future. But for now, let's just ask and just use some pixel graphics. Let's see. Okay,
And so
so
you
hopefully,
kind of use the coding agent while you're developing the.
yeah, exactly. The coordination should essentially plan and develop all the changes which we will be able to apply later. Yeah, looks okay. So there is a pipe, there's a bird. So at least those two elements are what is needed for the game. So I think we are on the right track. Okay. Okay, so for some explanation. Okay, let's try to apply this actually to the file. Okay, let me accept it actually first. Okay, let's try to run it. run this. Let's see how it works. So I think the file is called Flappy Bird. So let's try to run it. Let's hope it will work. Okay. Let me try to run
Ah,
it again. I'm not sure what is the controls. Okay, so I need to press space here, and yeah, I'm not very good at this.
but it did generate the game. That's very cool.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Let
Yep.
me try this again. I actually never played it on mobile phone when it was popular, but yeah, as you can see, I would probably fail miserably on the mobile phone as well.
No, that's really cool. Awesome. Now going on to the more relevant use cases to our developer audience here. Let's talk more about I would say, the developer use cases that would be useful. So let me bring up the presentation again here. Sorry, I posted down on my end. Just give me a second. But that was pretty cool that it was able to generate a game in a matter of seconds.
Yeah, we should maybe at some point start creating games as a side business.
Yeah, we need a game studio here. Yeah, cool. I think, yeah, so I wanted to actually showcase this slide before we actually get into the demo itself. But these are some of the features that Alex will be showcasing. Each of these features is powered by repo grokking, which is basically our understanding of our code base, and also the agentic repair pipelines that Alex showed, and the coding agent in specific can do multi-step workflows, which Alex will show. But yeah, we'll be starting out with code generation, code completion, which is blazing fast in Zencoder, then kind of show different agents that can be built out, including unit test, code review. And then also, we'd love to get your thoughts on if you could type your thoughts on some custom agents for us to go think about and build in the background, that would be helpful as well. But custom agents are workflows or repetitive tasks that you can build as a developer yourself within Zencoder. So I'll pass it on to Alex, and Alex, you can walk us through the different features here.
Yeah, thank you. And just in case, we have a Q&A session available in Zoom. If you have any questions, feel free to type them there, and we will answer them. Okay, so I see a hand actually. James, you can just type the question here in Q&A session, and we will be able to answer it. Okay, but let me go back to the VS Code. I actually opened a different project right now without any Flappy Birds, unfortunately, or fortunately. Yeah, basically, as Arch mentioned, we built our product on top of two main concepts, which are repo and AI agents. Now, repo allows us to work with the whole repository, and this, as I mentioned, can be especially important for cases where you have a large repository and a lot of files, and you probably might not even remember or know which content is in those files, which files are responsible for what part of the system and whatnot. So this repo essentially allows us to work with the whole repository. I can see there are some questions, so Archie, feel free to interrupt me if there are any questions related to the demo. But yeah, basically,
Sorry,
repo
Alex,
allows us.
where are the
Yeah,
questions? I don't see anything on the webinar chat.
there should be a Q&A session for you available on the
Oh,
bottom
okay, I see it.
panel.
Got it.
Can you
Let's
see
keep
it?
going. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, no worries. Yeah, there is three messages already. Feel free to interrupt me if there is anything. But yeah, basically, repo allows us to work with the whole repository as context and find any relevant pieces of the code, any relevant pieces of the file, text files, or whatever, which might be relevant to the question you asked in the chat or to the code generation request, which you typed in the code generation section. Now, the best way to showcase that is obviously in the chat. Because this repo technology essentially allows you to chat with your repository. So you can ask any questions about your repo, about your code base, or something from something general, all the way to something more specific, like what's the default value of something and what something else. And yeah, let's basically try to do exactly that. Over here, I have the project called Hatchet. And let's say I'm a new developer who came in, just joined the company, just the first time opening the project. So I might want to get a sort of brief overview of the project, of this repository, just trying to understand what it does, what kind of components it has, and so on. So I can just ask Encoder to do exactly that. So explain my project. Okay, so now while Encoder is collecting the relevant context, relevant information, oh, sorry, looks like I don't have my key set, but yeah, I don't need that actually. for the purpose of the demo. And you actually don't need either to add any custom keys. You can do that if you want to. As you've seen, we have the ability for you to bring your own key, but in general, that's not needed. We can rely on us to provide any sort of keys behind the scene for you. Let's do that again. Now, Zencoder should collect any relevant pieces of information. And while it's doing its thing, I will also briefly talk about the repository. As I mentioned, it's called Hatchet. It's an open source repository, so you can find it on GitHub. And this is essentially a task queuing system written in 3 languages. So we have Python, obviously, over here. As you can see, there is Python SDK, there is Go over here, and there is a section for the front end in, I think it's JavaScript and TypeScript over here. Yeah, so it's TypeScript. So it's basically 3 languages inside the single repository. And let's see what Encoder gave us. Yeah, indeed, Hatchet is a distributed task queuing system. There are some key components, some overview of those components, some multiple languages. Indeed, as I just mentioned, this repository contains code in 3 languages, namely Python, TypeScript, and Go. There is some mention of Python SDK, which I have open right here, some core concepts, use cases, and whatnot. Basically, it would provide you a brief overview. On your first day, you would feel more comfortable diving deeper into the project. But let's actually try to ask something more code-based specific. So let's say on your second day of working on this project, your manager or your colleague wanted to know what is the default value for something, and you don't know where the hell in the repository this is even defined. But we can help with that as well, just because we can work with the whole repository, so we can find any relevant pieces of the information to answer those questions. So let's say in this specific repository over here, I have a client config, and it sits somewhere in the repository. Again, I don't remember what the file is and whatnot. But let's say we want to know the host and port for that config. So we can ask Zencoder exactly that. What's the default host and port in the client config? Now, Zencoder again should find any relevant pieces of code, any relevant pieces of the files which are important to answer this question, and it will provide the information. So indeed, we now know that config is defined in the file loader.py, and the value is localhost 7070. Let me actually open that file to double check that. So loader.py over here, there is the client config, and indeed, I believe the answer is localhost 7070. Without going through all the searches, skimming through all the code base, you could just find the answer to any question in a matter of seconds, regardless how familiar you are with the code base, just because Zencoder will be able to extract any relevant pieces of the context and leverage that to give you more personalized answers. But we, of course, also use that not just for chat. It would be a waste to only use it in chat. We also use that for code generation. And this allows us in turn to not just generate a code, but also try to capture the coding style, try to use any helper functions, which you might already have defined in the code base. So basically, we try to generate a code which is as close to your own style of coding as possible, essentially. And I will showcase that in a second. But for now, I would like to switch to the second part, which Archie mentioned, which is AI agents. Now, what is AI agents? Basically, you can think about it as a software which is tasked by you to perform some specific task, essentially on your behalf. And it can also interact with your environment. So it's not just blindly generating the code. It also can access your environment. It knows what kind of build tools you use, for example, what kind of dependencies your project has, and so on. And we can leverage that in AI agentic world to, again, not just simply generate the code, but we can also try to run the code. We can try to compile the code. And if there are any errors on each of those steps, we can fix that errors for you, essentially. Now, the best way to demonstrate this, and let me close the chat here. Now, the best way to demonstrate this is our unit testing agent. which will essentially generate the tests for any function or any code you have in your code base. So let me call that. Now, as you can see, unlike our competitors, we don't start generating the code right away. We of course do that at some point, but first we generate a test proposal or test plan, which is actually one of the sort of design principles of agents. They not just simply generate something from LLM, they also try to plan something, they try to reflect on this planning and so on. So in our case, with the test agent, you can see we got some test plan for us for this function. But we can also, of course, add any special corner cases if we wanted to test something more specific. Now, once we start generation, again, we don't just generate the code. Of course, we do that as a first step. But then on top of that, we also try to do, as I mentioned, a lot of checks, just because we know more information about your environment, and we can leverage that to give you much better generations, much better predictions based on your requests. And in this case, as you can see, we do the syntax check, we try to run the code, and if there are any errors, we essentially try to fix them for you. So in the end, you get the code which you don't need to spend time on debugging. You can just commit and push it right away. Like there is some it looks like everything is fine. I don't see any warnings or any highlights from the IDE. So it looks like everything is great. We got ourselves some test data over here. So everything looks good. Okay. Let's save that file. And we are good with our unit test agent. And you can basically leverage that to cover your code base with unit tests. And let's be honest, nobody loves writing unit tests, and it's boring and not so creative. But with the Zencoder, you can basically offload that task to AI. Now, apart from unit test agent, we of course also have coding agent, as Archie mentioned. So in addition to generating tests, we can ask the coding agent to generate something, as you've already seen that in action with the game, where we generate something from scratch, but it can, of course, also work inside the existing repository. Now, let's use that to update our config and our token extraction. So over here, in this file, I have a couple of functions which are extracting some data from JWT token. So it gets tenant ID, it gets some addresses over here, and those functions are used to populate the config, the client config over here. As you can see, there is a class called config loader, which uses those functions to get some information from the token. Now, let's say we also want, in addition to those three items, we also want to get host from the client config and use that in the sorry, not from the client config. We want to get a host from JWT token and use that in the client config. So essentially, we would need to do some changes in two files at the same time. Now, let's ask our coding agent to do exactly that. So let's see, extract host from JWT and use that in the client config. And let's turn our coding agent on. It's still on beta, so that's why it's turned on by default. But basically, what happens under the hood is agent will try to find what files are relevant to that request, what files it needs to modify to make that request happen, basically. And then using those files, it will suggest the changes which needs to happen. So over here, indeed, we do need to change something in two files, token.py, which I have open here, and loader.py. And again, as you can see, you don't need to have those files open. When you use coding agent, it will find all the relevant files for you, essentially, and it will suggest any changes in what should look like pretty familiar interface. So it's like git diff like interface, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with. Now, you can also, of course, apply those changes with just a single click of the button. So let's go ahead and see what changes are needed for this file, for example. Let's click show diff. And okay, so it looks like we now got get host from this function over here. So it now returns three elements. Let's actually go ahead and check changes in this file as well. And indeed, as you can see here, this function now returns three elements, not just server URL and gRPC broadcast address, but also host. So indeed, when we call this function here in the second file, we did need to change the way it returns and handles the values over here. And now if the host is specified, we use that in the host and port variable. Okay, looks good. Let me accept this. Okay. Yeah. So on top of that, in addition to those two agents, which we already have predefined for you, you can also leverage Zencoder and you leverage all this repair pipeline and environment checks and whatnot to create your own agents. Essentially, you can just automate any repetitive tasks, any boring tasks you might have in your everyday life. So we already mentioned things like legacy code, so I know conversion from one library to another, and so on. And with Encoder, you can basically now create your own tool in a tool, if you will, which will be able to do that, to do those mundane things for you. And it's as simple as going to this menu and just giving the agent a name and your instruction. And of course, you can also, as I mentioned, leverage the repair pipeline, which will try to check the generated code or do syntax checks, try to run the code, compile the code, and whatnot, and fix any errors which might arise during those checks. Now, I already have here two agents defined. So one is code reviewer, which basically will review the code and make sure it complies to some standards, make sure that the line length is acceptable and whatnot. And you can imagine this agent being used, for example, throughout your company by all developers to make sure that all the changes that they make in the code are consistent with the coding style which you have preferred in your company. Of course, it doesn't need to be just a style. It can also be some security checks, some optimization checks, and whatnot. Whatever you want to check for, you can define here. And then the second agent is a converter. In this case, it would convert the code from older Python version to a newer Python version and leverage one of the new operators, which were introduced, I think, in Python 3.8. But yeah, basically, again, you can imagine these custom agent being used for converting some legacy code to a new version of language, to a new version of the library, or even to switch from one library to another one. And of course, you can define as many agents as you want, basically automating any task which you might have in your everyday life. Now, in addition to that, and my cat is trying to get some attention from me here, so I might log down a bit occasionally. But in addition to that, in addition to agents, we of course also have features similar to what you might find in any other coding assistant. Things like, again, which Archie already mentioned, like code completion, which is really fast. So you can basically just get the code generated for you. Let's try that in action. Def get mail. So I can just basically tap and generate, I don't know, hundreds of lines of code. I do then need to do something with that code, but basically you can generate as much code as possible. Let me get here. Once I mentioned. But yeah, as you can see, it is also context aware. So we also reuse any helper functions you might already have. In this case, we have these extra claims from JWT, which is of course needed to get info from the token, and we will reuse that in the code completion. And we also try to capture the styles. Those functions look pretty similar to what we already have defined over here in those functions. Let me remove that actually. And we can achieve pretty much the same thing of generating code from scratch, not just by clicking tab continuously, but we can also guide Zencoder or ask in the natural language form what we want to generate. And it will generate the code for us. It is also context aware. So let me try to do that. Over here, we have this hotkey. So let me call the code generation pop-up window and ask the encoder to, let's say, also extract emails from JWT, pretty much the same thing which we've just seen with the code completion. Now, again, as you can see, as you've seen with the unit tests, we don't just simply generate the code. Okay, it was too quick. But we don't just generate the code, we don't just stream the code, stream the output of LLM. We also try to repair the code if there are any issues with that generated code. In this case, seems like there were no issues, so it went pretty fast. And again, we try to capture the style of the already existing functions. We try to reuse any helper functions. So basically, we don't just generate the code, we try to personalize it towards your code base, towards your repository. Let me actually reject it. Now, in addition to generating code from scratch, we can, of course, also use Zencoder to edit the code, edit existing code. So let's say we want to edit this function. We can refactor it to just a single call of the specialized library. Let's ask Zencoder to do exactly that. Over here, let's edit the code, and we can ask Zencoder to rewrite this using JWT. Now, JWT in this case is the name of the library, which, as you might guess from the name, is handling the JWT tokens. Now, again, we don't start streaming the code right away. We, of course, will generate it, but then we are trying to do some repairs if there are any issues with it, and it looks like there were indeed some issues with the encoder itself, which we will need to debug with our product team. Let me try it again, actually. Oh, sorry, not the tests. Let's generate the code. I think sometimes VS Code gets a bit wonky with the cache of the files. So let me do that again. Right, using the JWT. Let's see if Zencoder will be able to handle this the second time. Hopefully it will, because otherwise we will need to have a serious conversation with our product team. Okay, this is what I wanted to see in the first place. That's great. So basically, as I mentioned, we can rewrite this function as a single line, as a single function call over here, jwt.decode. And for that to happen, we, of course, we first need to change the code over here. But on top of that, we also need to update our imports because we no longer need those two imports over here, those two libraries, but we now need this library over here. So basically, we don't just handle the code generation as a function. We also handle all the surrounding things like imports, changes in the function signature, where in the places where this function called, and so on. So let me accept this. Okay, so I think now this function looks much more readable, much more understandable, and much more maintainable compared to the previous version, which was, I think, like 7 lines of code, basically self-written of this single call. And then last but not least, of course, we can also document the code with just a single click of a button over here, generate description. We will get the docstring for our function in a matter of seconds, and we can basically accept it. So now we have the code, which is just single line of the call function, and it is nicely documented, and it is already also covered with the tests over here on the token test.py. And with that, oh, actually, usually I stop here, but we actually just recently released new functionality in addition to that code over here, to those features I've shown over here. So let me try to see if, yeah, over here it is available. So we now also have these sort of slash commands, which you can use to, as you can see, explain, fix, or review the code. And let's say you want to have some sort of security review or whatnot. So we can just ask the encoder to review that file over here. Okay, VS Code keep asking me to install something for the Go, which I don't need. But yeah, maybe someday VS Code, someday. But yeah, again, as you can see, the encoder can give you some information, some suggestions on that file, for example, over here, both in terms of code style, in terms of efficiency, some security considerations over here. So basically, you can have some sort of, okay, there is also even some code suggestions, but basically you get a sort of separate pair of eyes, if you want, of virtual eyes, which can help you check the code for the quality, for the security vulnerabilities and whatnot, and if there are any things which might need to be changed, you can also ask Encoder to implement them. So in this case, apparently we need to add more exceptions, which I guess fair enough. And with that, I think, Archie, back to you. And I see there are a lot of questions in Q&A. Anything related to demo?
Yeah, no, I think Alex, there's a few questions around repo
Mhm.
grokking, how we different than
Mhm.
Copilot, Codium Cursor. So Bogdan had a question on that. You want to put your lens on it? I gave my
Mhm.
lens on how we are different.
Yeah, so on the reprogramming, first of all, at least for my experiments, from my experience and from what we benchmarked internally, our reprogramming, or you can call it RAG, but it's much more than RAG. It is much more sophisticated. So we don't just simply convert the code to vectors. The typical sort of RAG pipeline, you just take the pieces of the code and convert them to vectors and then do a vector search. Of course, that is one part of our reprogramming technology, but on top of that, we also do a lot of AST3 parsing, for example. We also try to leverage extract and leverage any information which we might get from the code itself. And we also try to do some synthetic data augmentation over there from the code. So it's not as simple as just getting a vector and then just doing the vector search. So again, in our case, it's much more involved, much more in depth, and more personalized to your specific repository.
Yep. And then there was another one around repo grokking again. Does it only work with repos or does it work with folders and source code? And I think you can show the settings and show how to configure repo grokking. Maybe that's helpful for folks.
Yeah, right now we work with any text file essentially. You can also exclude any files if you don't want them to be included. Since I have Python and TypeScript here, it might make sense to exclude build or dist or other things which might be not so useful for repo. But yeah, again, let me see if, for example, in explaining my project, we have the list of the files used, and as you can see, it's not just the code files, it's also some JSONs, some markdowns, some TypeScript files. So basically, any text file which is available in your repository, we can use that to give you the answer.
Cool. All right. I think those are the questions I saw in the Q&A. While you're
Yeah.
opening
So
up,
let
I think you
me.
should open the Q&A to like just have.
I'm looking at it. So let me go through the questions. It's just saved prompts you pre-made or there's more. So on the question of the coding agents, if they are just saved prompts or if there is more to this feature, if you're talking about, oh, it's about coding agents. So again, first of all, they can leverage your environment, so they can basically run the code, they can check the code. We also will be adding things like tool usage, web search, and whatnot pretty soon, I think the next month or two. And then also custom agents would be able to leverage that, and you would also be able, with the custom agents, make them call other agents. So basically, you can imagine defining several virtual developers, virtual assistants, and being able to create a pipeline of those agents just inside your IDE. So basically, like a bricks of Lego, you will be able to create your pipeline of AI assistants, which will be working together to generate a code for you, or to solve the tasks for you. Will custom agents change my code without my approval? No, it won't. So as I've shown, there is a button. Where is it? Yeah, there's a button over here. So basically, you will be able to see the changes which are suggested by the coding agent, but it won't change the code without your consent. Parameter extraction doesn't know those parameters. Yes, I think the question is about the JWT token parameters in the unit tests over here, if I understand correctly. So I guess the question is about those test cases that claims not. So those are actually generated by Zencoder based on what the function does and what kind of input it takes. In this case, it takes a token, JWT token, I believe. Zencoder will generate some test data for you, and then it will run the generated code with those test cases, with those test data. And if there are any issues, it will fix them. So all these tokens are essentially generated by encoder automatically behind the scenes. Okay, for example, if I log into SSH and edit my files or SSH on remote machine, the next point takes forever. Can I follow folder I'm in? Okay, Maxim Tinchenko, I think that's a question for some specific use case which you're experiencing. I think it might make sense to connect in our community if you are experiencing any issues with encoder. But in general, it should scan only the folder, or basically the folder of your project. Indeed, if there are large files, it can take some time. So that's why we also have sorry, let me go to Zencoder. We also have some, as I've shown, some exclusion, which you can base on either git ignore, or you can also add your own. So if you know if there are any large files which you don't want to be part of, so let's say, I know, some node modules or whatever, which of course can take forever to be scanned, that could affect the speed. But again, I suggest to reach out to me through community, either in Slack or Discord, and we can take a look at what is happening in your specific case. Okay, next question is, how does your code checker differ from other VS Code checker extension? Yeah, so I guess the question refers to this custom agent, which I've shown. Oops, sorry, didn't meant to run it. Let me open it. Guess the question was related to this. Again, as I mentioned, it doesn't necessarily need to be just about linters. Conforming to PEP 8 or whatever standards, which your basic linters can do as well. In Zencoder, you can, as I've shown in the review functionality, you can also ask Zencoder to, check the code not just for the style, but also for security vulnerabilities, some optimizations and whatnot. So it's much more than just any MyPy or whatever you use in your project. Okay, next question is, what LLM do you use? So we actually use a mix of models, and I can see Archie's typing there, but it will be probably quicker to answer that verbally. Basically, as I mentioned, we use a mix of models, and that's because, as you've seen, we have a pipeline of different steps, and some models work better for different steps. So we try to find the best model for each specific step, so that in the end you get the best results possible. That being said, I know that some people prefer, let's say, talk with Claude or talk with ChatGPT, and because of that, in the chat, for example, you can also now choose the model. Right now, it is through your own API key, but pretty soon you will also be able to use our internal API key for that as well. So you won't need to provide your own key. You will be able to just switch the model which you want to talk with in the chat. Okay, are any languages first class in encoders like Python and JavaScript, while others are second class, for example, Ruby, Elixir, etc.? That's a good question. Indeed, for some languages, we do give a better or more in-depth support compared to others. So of course, features like code completion or code generation or chat, for that matter, work with any language. And of course, it will work much better with languages which are much more present in the open source. I can see some question about Cabal. Good throwback. But yeah, I didn't test with Cabal, and maybe that could be a topic for our next webinar, trying to encode with some exotic languages. But yeah, again, languages which are much more popular, are much more sort of present in the open source and whatnot, they are, of course, supported much better. And also features where we need to go more in depth, more into leveraging the environment, trying to run the code and whatnot. This set of languages is a bit more limited. And Archie, I don't know if here we have a slide for that or not, but basically right now for those features which involve interacting with the environment, we have a more in-depth support for Python, JavaScript, TypeScript, Java, Kotlin, C#, C++, C, and Go, I believe. And pretty soon the rest will follow. So we obviously, of course, working on extending that list to full potential. But of course, as I mentioned, things like code completion works with any language. It actually even work with not just code. So me as a DevOps, MLOps engineer, I do occasionally use code completion for YAML files. So basically, any text-based files would work with the code completion, essentially. And the last question, which Archie is also typing, but I probably will be faster. If you were to summarize 3 features the encoder has that are missing or not as good in compiled, cursor, etc., what would you say those are? That's a good question, I think, and I've attended a bunch of conferences and got some feedback from people there. I think things like unit test generation are much better implemented in Zencoder. Again, for example, in Compilot or Cursor or whatever, they will start the streaming the code for you right away. And usually it won't work at the first attempt. It might not work at the second attempt. It might not work at all. In our case, we make sure that the code works. And that's why, that this is allowed uh, because we can essentially use your environment, use your project, and understand your project much better than just asking just asking LLM to generate the code blindly. In our case, we provide some context, we provide some dependencies and whatnot, and we can again use that to give you much better generations. In addition to that, we've seen custom agents in action. Basically, you can create your own tools, essentially, right, inside our tool, and you can use that to automate any tasks which you might have specific to your code base, specific to your environment, specific to your company, and whatnot. What else? Archie? I guess AI agents in general is something which I think is better implemented or is missing in our competitors. So I think Copilot doesn't have any agentic behavior. Cursor, I think, does have something, but again, you've seen the same during the demo. Our
Yep.
agents can essentially, do much more than our competitors.
Yeah,
Um,
and I think the question also is getting at what are we missing? And I don't think it's missing, it's a choice by intention, is that we want to be where the devs are and in their environment. So VS Code and JetBrains IDs, as opposed to fork out VS Code, maybe Cursor and even Windsurf has done on Codium. That is the choice we've made because we want to be where the devs work. That is different in our platform, right? Where you actually work
yeah,
within the IDs yourself.
yeah, and I think it actually answers the most recent question from Bogdan about forking creating a specialized ID. As Arch mentioned, that's basically a deliberate decision. And me, myself, I prefer PyCharm or IntelliJ when I'm working the code, and switching to a completely different idea would probably be a nightmare. I still don't like VS Code, even though I use VS Code to run the demos and whatnot. I really hate it, to be honest. Don't tell Microsoft about it, but I don't like it. And switching to a completely different IDE, to a completely different world, especially if you're talking about large companies where they have some sort of pipelines already defined in those based on those IntelliJ or PyCharm or whatever, maybe self-written plugins for those IDs, it can be quite a nightmare. So that's why we decided to go through the route of plugin rather than the fork of the IDE. Now that being said, in the future, who knows, maybe we also create some sort of specialized ID, but I don't know. And the question I've skipped over here is any plans for R language? As I said, is supported for majority of features like for the code completion, code generation, and whatnot. If we are talking about the part of the more in-depth understanding of the language, unit test generation or whatnot, R is, of course, is one of the languages on our roadmap. Won't be able to give any specific timelines right now. But I know that, again, from my past as a bioinformatician, I know that R is pretty popular language still, and I think it's worth supporting. But again, as I said, things like code completion, code generation, or chat would work without any issues with R. They should, and if that's not the case, please reach out through the community or through our email, support@zencoder.ai, and we will work with you to see what's going on there. Okay, James, thanks to you. Thanks for joining us and thanks for listening. Okay, and with that, I think that's all of the questions we have here in the Q&A session.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
have the community Slack up here, so feel free to join our community Slack. And if there are questions, reach out directly to Alex, myself, or you can just ask questions in the community general chat as well. Happy to answer anything, but very good having you all, and thanks for your time today.
thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.